The blizzard wanted him dead. The boy wanted to kill him. And Elias Ward, trapped between two storms, knew he would have to choose which one he would face first to survive the night. The blizzard struck the mountain pass like a mailed fist, driving sleet sideways until the world shrank to a stuttering heartbeat of white and black. Pines cracked beneath the weight of ice. The wind howled through them with the voice of something ancient and starving. Inside the abandoned signal hut, half buried beneath a drift as tall as a man, Elias Ward pressed his shoulder to the warped door and felt the hinges shudder with every gust. The lantern in his gloved hand guttered, throwing wild shadows against the log walls, then steadied into a small, defiant sun. He had been walking since dusk, following a rumor of a safe trail that had vanished under fresh snow. Now his beard was a frozen mask, his rifle a bar across his back, his breath fogging the lantern glass. He thought of the valley below, of supper left cooling on a table he might never see again, and the thought tasted like iron. The door resisted one last time, then gave with a splintering shriek. Elias stumbled inside and slammed it shut, setting his weight against the wood until the latch bit home. For a moment he simply stood there, chest heaving, listening to the storm batter the walls like a siege engine. Then the lantern's glow found the boy. Cale was huddled beside the rusted iron stove, knees drawn to his chin, eyes too large for the hollows of his face. Snow still clung to the ragged collar of his cloak, and in the lantern light Elias saw the glint of a silver clasp. Fine work, too fine for a scrawny fugitive. One end was broken, as though torn from richer fabric. The boy's fingers curled around a knife so short it was almost a toy, but the blade caught the light with professional malice. "Don't come closer," Cale rasped. His voice cracked between child and man, fear and fury. "I've killed for less than warmth." Elias raised both hands, lantern swaying. The motion showed the split seams of his coat, the worn patch on his elbow where wind now knifed through. "Storm's already trying to do the job for you," he said. "I'm just looking to share a roof." For a beat, the only sound was the wind shrieking through the eaves. Then the boy's shoulders twitched, half shiver, half shrug, and the knife lowered a finger's breadth. Elias stepped carefully into the center of the hut. The floorboards groaned beneath crusted snow that had blown under the door. He set the lantern on the stove and saw the ashes inside were cold, white as bone. "Got flint?" he asked. Cale hesitated, then nodded toward a dented tin box. Elias knelt, hands clumsy with cold, and struck sparks into a twist of birch bark. Flame licked up, hungry. He fed it splinters, then larger sticks scavenged from a broken crate. The stove began to tick and sigh, and the first thread of warmth crawled across the room. Only then did Elias turn back to the boy. Up close he saw the bruise blooming across Cale's cheekbone, the split lip, the feverish glitter in his eyes. The silver clasp winked every time he breathed, as though keeping its own secret tally. "Name's Elias Ward," he said. "You got one, Cale?" The boy swallowed. "They'll hang me if they catch me. Winter's hanging us both right now." Elias peeled off a glove, flexed stiff fingers toward the stove. "What did you do to earn the rope?" Cale's gaze slid to the broken clasp, then away. "Punched the tax collector's son. He bled on the courthouse steps." A ghost of a smile touched his split lip. "The silver was mine before it was his." Outside, something heavy collapsed with a muffled boom. Perhaps a branch, perhaps the entire ridge. The lantern flame shivered. Elias felt the cold reach deeper, past wool and skin, toward the marrow. He reached into his pack and drew out a heel of black bread, rock hard. Broke it in two. "Eat," he said, offering the larger piece. "Storm doesn't care whose blood is on whose hands." Cale stared at the bread as though it might bite him. Then his stomach growled, loud in the sudden hush. He took the offering, tore off a strip with his teeth, and chewed like a wolf guarding its kill. Elias watched the firelight catch in the boy's eyes and wondered how many winters it would take for that hunger to turn into something else. The stove popped. Embers scattered across the hearthstone like tiny red stars. Elias leaned closer, letting the heat sting his cheeks. Somewhere in the distance he thought he heard the baying of hounds, or maybe it was only the wind playing tricks with memory. He glanced at the door, thin planks against the mountain's fury, and felt the first true chill of the night settle in his bones. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The fire grew, casting their shadows huge and wavering on the log walls. Outside, the storm wrote its own language across the night, and somewhere beyond the ridge, men with torches and rifles began to move. Dawn never truly arrived. It only turned the inside of the hut from pitch to bruised gray. Elias woke to the sound of claws skittering across the threshold. Sharp, deliberate, not wind. He was on his feet before the echo died, rifle off his shoulder and cocked in one motion. The lantern had burned low, its flame a trembling eyelid. Beside the stove, Cale slept sitting up, knife still across his knees like a child clinging to a toy sword. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine that raised the hair on Elias's neck. Not a wolf, too tame. A hound, trained and hungry. He stepped to the frost-filmed window and scraped a clear circle with his sleeve. Outside, the world was a moving white wall, but through it he saw the orange flicker of torches. 3, maybe 4, bobbing like corpse lights toward the hut. "They found me," Cale whispered. He was awake now, eyes wide and dark as river stones. He held the silver clasp so tightly his knuckles looked ready to split. "They found your trail," Elias corrected. "There's a difference." Boots crunched on packed snow, close, maybe 20 paces. A voice barked an order, muffled by wind. Elias's heart hammered once, hard, then settled into the calm rhythm of a man counting cartridges. He glanced at the stove. Embers still glowed, enough to catch a log if they fed it. Enough to make smoke that could be seen for miles. He kicked the damper shut instead. "We run," Cale said, already rising. "Run where?" Elias jerked his chin toward the back wall. The drift outside had piled halfway up the logs, sealing the only other door. "Storm buried us alive." The hound yelped, closer now, excited by fresh scent. Elias crossed to Cale in 2 strides and crouched, eyes level with the boys. "Listen. 1 man walks out there, they'll ask questions. 2 men walk out, they'll shoot first." Cale's throat worked. "I won't let you hang for me." "You won't," Elias said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. He tugged the silver clasp from Cale's grip, turned it over in his palm. The metal was warm from the boy's skin, its broken hinge catching the faint lamplight like a wink. "But that tax collector's son remembers this clasp. If they find it on you, they won't bother with questions." He moved before hesitation could root. With the butt of his rifle, he shattered the clasp against the stove's iron leg. The pieces clinked down among the ashes, dull and unrecognizable. Cale stared as though Elias had broken his last keepsake of the world. Outside, a man shouted, "Circle the back!" Snow squealed under heavy boots. Elias straightened. "Here's how this plays. You stay low, behind the stove. When the door opens, you don't move unless I go down. Then you take the rifle and you make them earn every step between you and the rope. And if you don't go down, then we walk out together, and you owe me a story that starts with a hot meal instead of a hanging." Cale's mouth twisted, half gratitude, half terror. He nodded once. The first blow hit the door like a hammer made of wind and wood. Elias stepped forward, shoulders squared, rifle held loose at his side. The second blow splintered the latch. Snow and lantern light spilled in together, framing 3 men in city coats, faces red with cold and righteous anger. Behind them the hound strained on a rope, lips peeled back from yellow teeth. Elias Ward, the tallest one, called, "Breath fogging. Step aside. We've business with the thief inside." "Only thief I see," Elias answered, voice steady as a plumb line, "is the one who took a boy's winter and left him in rags." The officer's gloved hand dropped to the pistol at his belt. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Behind Elias, the stove ticked as metal cooled. He could feel Cale's presence like a heartbeat pressed against his spine. Snow sifted through the broken door and hissed on the embers. Somewhere in the distance a second dog bayed, joined by a third, the sound rolling down the mountain like an avalanche of teeth. Elias took one slow step backward, placing himself squarely between the men and the boy. "Hard is all that's left," he said. "But you'll have to walk through me to get to him." For a heartbeat the hut held its breath. Then the officer smiled, thin and winter-cruel, and drew his pistol with the smooth certainty of a man who had never lost a standoff. Outside, the storm answered with a fresh howl, as though the mountain itself were choosing sides. The courthouse square was a slab of gray ice under a pewter sky. Spring had begun to whisper in the valley, runoff hissing in the gutters, the sharp smell of pine pollen drifting. But the thaw had not yet reached stone or conscience. Elias stood at the foot of the scaffold, coat unbuttoned to the wind, and felt every eye in Willow Creek bore into the back of his neck like awls. Cale knelt on the platform above him, wrists bound so tightly the rope bit bright beads of blood. A bruise the color of storm clouds bloomed across his left cheek. The tax collector's son, Frederick Voss, stood beside the magistrate with his arm in a sling and a smile carved thin across his mouth. Around them the crowd rustled, equal parts pity and hunger for spectacle. "Stand witness," the bailiff called, voice echoing off storefronts. "Elias Ward, you were present the night this boy stole the silver clasp from the Voss manor. Speak the truth before God and county." Elias felt the words lodge in his throat like a shard of ice. He had rehearsed them all night. Yes, the boy confessed. Yes, the clasp was found in his pack. Yes, justice must be served. Yet now each syllable tasted of iron and ash. Somewhere behind the front line of spectators he knew Cale's eyes were on him. Wide, dark, trusting in a way that cut deeper than any accusation. The magistrate cleared his throat. "Mr. Ward, the court awaits." Elias lifted his gaze to the platform. Sunlight broke through the clouds in a single slanted blade, striking the broken halves of the silver clasp that lay on the bailiff's table. The pieces winked like malevolent stars, as though mocking the night they had been shattered in a lonely hut. He remembered the warmth of the stove, the boy's trembling hand as he surrendered the clasp, the promise Elias had made without speaking. "I won't let them take you." Frederick Voss shifted his weight, wincing theatrically. "Speak up, Ward. The boy nearly stove my skull in. A man should pay for that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elias saw the baker's wife clutch her shawl tighter, saw the blacksmith spit into the slush, saw the preacher's daughter hide her face. All of them waiting for the word that would drop the trapdoor. Elias drew a breath that felt like swallowing splinters. The sound that came out was not the testimony he had practiced. It was a scrape of dry leaves, a confession fighting to stay buried. He closed his fist around something in his pocket. The small iron key to the signal hut, still warm from his skin. On its bow was etched the faintest line of silver, melted remnants of the clasp he had destroyed. "Mr. Ward," the magistrate repeated, sterner now. "Did the boy steal the clasp?" Above, Cale's shoulders jerked as if the rope had already tightened. His lips moved, no sound, just a single word Elias read by shape alone. "Please." Snowmelt dripped from the scaffold beam, ticking like a clock counting down heartbeats. Elias felt the weight of every lie he had ever told to survive, every promise broken for the sake of bread or warmth. He thought of his own boy, dead of fever 3 winters past, and how he had begged the mountain for mercy it never gave till he lifted his chin. The sun slid behind a cloud. The square dimmed. In that sudden hush he heard the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, steady and unhurried, shaping iron into something useful. "No," Elias said. The word left his mouth before fear could smother it. "He never stole it." A collective gasp rippled outward like rings on a pond. Frederick Voss's face flushed scarlet. The magistrate's gavel froze mid-air. "Explain yourself." The magistrate snapped that Elias's voice steadied. Each syllable a stone dropped into deep water. "The clasp was mine. I traded it to the boy for safe passage through the pass. He was guiding me home. If anyone's to be held, let it be me." Frederick lunged forward. "Liar! He wore it on his cloak." "Because I gave it to him," Elias answered, meeting the younger man's fury without flinching. Ask the blacksmith. He saw me melt the clasp too. Nights ago. The pieces you hold are forgeries. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in wonder. Above them, Cale's eyes widened, stunned gratitude flooding his face. The bailiff hesitated, glancing between Elias and the magistrate as though the ground itself had shifted beneath their feet. Snow began to fall again, soft as confession. Elias felt it melt against his lashes, tasted its cold purity on his tongue. He did not look at the scaffold. He looked at the iron key in his palm, at the faint silver vein threading its spine, and knew that some debts were paid not in coin but in courage. The magistrate's voice cut through the swirl of voices. Take the witness into custody. We'll have the truth, one way or another. 2 guards stepped forward. Elias offered his wrists without resistance. As the cold metal of manacles closed around them, he lifted his eyes to the platform one last time. Cale was weeping now, silent tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Snowflakes settled on Elias's shoulders like small, weightless blessings. The square had begun to empty, muttering crowds scattering into side streets. But the echo of his single word, "No," lingered in the air long after the scaffold was dismantled. It clung to the corners of shuttered windows, to the ringing anvil of the blacksmith, to the slow drip of thawing icicles later. When the cell door clanged shut behind him, Elias sat on the narrow cot and closed his eyes. He could still feel the warmth of the signal hut stove against his palms, could still taste the black bread shared in darkness. Somewhere beyond these stone walls, a boy who had once knelt in chains now walked free. The debt was not yet settled, Elias knew. But the first coin had been paid in full, and the mountain was listening. 12 springs after the scaffold, rain came to Willow Creek like a penitent drummer. Soft, steady, relentless. It washed the winter's soot from the courthouse bricks and pooled in the boot prints left by the last patrol of tax men. Elias Ward stood beneath the dripping eaves of what had once been his own smithy, watching strangers nail a foreclosure notice across the door his grandfather had carved. He was thinner now, hair the color of forge ash, hands still scarred by the irons that had held him for 6 long months. Behind him, the valley had changed. New telegraph wires humming like distant bees. The Voss Manor painted a cheerful butter yellow, its iron gates flung wide to welcome the magistrate who had replaced the old collector. The scaffold was gone. Torn down the same week, Cale disappeared into the mountains. Only the stump of the beam remained, slick with moss, as though the earth itself were trying to erase the memory. Elias's wife, Sarah, stood beside him clutching their daughter's hand. Little Mara, named for the bitter herb, had grown 3 inches since winter, but her coat sleeves still fell short. The notice fluttered in the rain, its red wax seal bleeding like a fresh wound. 3 days to vacate. 3 days to watch 3 generations of iron and sweat be sold to strangers. Sarah's voice was low. We could take the wagon north. There's word of work in the rail camps. Elias shook his head. A man can't outrun a debt that's chained to his name. Behind them, the courthouse bell tolled noon. The sound rolled across wet cobblestones and caught in the mouths of alleyways, echoing like the last word of an unfinished trial. Elias closed his eyes and felt the clasp, now whole and warm, resting against his ribs beneath his shirt. A blacksmith in the prison yard had soldered the broken halves together with copper and prayer, and Elias had carried it ever since. A small, round silver disc etched with a mountain laurel, its edges smoothed by years of rubbing between finger and thumb. He had not seen Cale since the morning the cell door clanged open and the turnkey muttered, "You're free." Don't ask why. Rumors had drifted downriver like fallen leaves. The boy had vanished into the high passes, joined a band of outlaws, studied law by candle stub in a cave. Elias had learned not to trust rumors. He had learned to trust the weight of the clasp and the promise he had never spoken aloud. The rain thickened. Sarah guided Mara beneath the awning of the shuttered bakery. Elias remained in the open, letting the water run down his collar. He was reading the notice for the 3rd time, legal phrases like manacles, when a shadow fell across the paper. Those words still bite, don't they? The voice was quiet, almost amused. Elias looked up, and his heart stumbled. The boy? No, the man. Standing before him wore a dark green coat with silver buttons, the collar turned up against the rain. His hair was longer, streaked with premature frost at the temples, but the eyes were the same. Riverstone dark, steady as flint. Kale. Faint smile. Magistrate Kale now, if you please, though I answer to either. He gestured toward the courthouse. I was on my way to chambers when I saw the crowd. Thought I recognized an old debtor. Elias's throat closed. The rain sounded suddenly louder, as though the sky itself were leaning in to listen. Kale produced a folded parchment from inside his coat. Thick paper, red wax seal impressed with the same mountain laurel that adorned the clasp. He offered it without ceremony. 3 things, Kale said. First, the tax collector's son was found guilty last winter of forging land deeds. Your farm was one of them. Second, the sentence includes full restitution to the original owners. Third, his voice dropped, intimate despite the drumming rain. The original owner is standing right here. Sarah stepped forward, eyes wide. Mara tugged at her skirt, staring at the stranger who looked like a prince from a storybook. Elias unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers. The ink was fresh, the signature unmistakable. Below the legal phrasing, a single line had been added in a different hand. For the night you chose truth over rope. Kale reached into his pocket and drew out the silver clasp. It gleamed like captured starlight. I kept it safe. Thought you might want it back. He pressed it into Elias's palm. The metal was warm, as though it had been carried next to skin rather than locked in a drawer. Behind them, the crowd of onlookers had grown silent. Rain hissed on cobblestones. Somewhere a wagon wheel creaked, but no one moved to leave. They watched the magistrate and the blacksmith standing in the downpour. 2 men bound by a debt measured not in coin but in choices. Elias closed his fist around the clasp. You didn't owe me this. Kale's smile was small, almost shy. I owed you everything. The rope was mine to wear. You took it instead. He glanced at Sarah and Mara. Besides, a man should raise his children under his own roof. He raised his voice just enough for the crowd to hear. Effective immediately, the Ward farm is cleared of all liens. The notice is rescinded. He tore the foreclosure sheet from the door and let the rain wash the ink into pink rivulets at their feet. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mara darted forward and pressed a wet kiss to Elias's cheek, then to Kale's coat sleeve. The magistrate bent, solemn, and returned the kiss on the top of her head. Later, when the clouds parted and the sun broke through in sudden gold, Elias stood in the doorway of his restored smithy. The anvil rang again, the forge breathed fire, and the smell of coal and quenched iron filled the valley like a hymn. Sarah sang at the bellows, Mara hammered nails for toy horseshoes, and Kale, now in shirt sleeves, worked the bellows beside them as if he had been born to it sunset. Elias took the silver clasp from his pocket and threaded it onto a thin leather cord. He hung it around Kale's neck. For the night you chose to come back, he said. Kale touched the clasp and smiled. No longer the hunted boy in a frozen hut, but a man who had learned that mercy, once given, circles like spring rain and always finds its way home. The first day of true spring arrived on the back of a south wind, carrying the scent of thawing cedar and the promise of wheat. In the Ward forge, the fire had been burning since dawn. Orange tongues leaping against the brick throat of the chimney, sparks drifting like fireflies through the open doors. Elias stood at the anvil, sleeves rolled high, sweat cutting clean trails through the soot on his forearms. Each hammer blow rang out across the valley like a heartbeat returned to its proper rhythm. Sarah knelt beside the bellows, coaxing the flames with practiced tugs. Her hair, once threaded with premature gray, now glinted chestnut in the sunlight pouring through the doorway. Mara, no longer little but not yet grown, sat cross-legged on a sack of coal, shaping tiny horseshoes from the cut-offs Elias tossed her way. When she finished one, she held it up to the light, grinning at the perfect curve. For the toy horse Papa promised last winter, she announced solemnly, as though the contract had been signed in blood. Outside, the yard had changed. The foreclosure notice had been replaced by a trellis of climbing roses, their first buds tight as secrets. The old scaffold stump had been uprooted and burned. Elias had used the ash to sweeten the forge floor. Now, where the beam once stood, a young apple tree leaned in the breeze, petals drifting across the cobblestones like pale confetti. Cale arrived just after the noon bell. He no longer wore the magistrate's green coat. Instead, a plain linen shirt, sleeves rolled just past the elbow, revealed the faint white scar across his left forearm, the mark of a boy who had once clung to a knife for courage. In one hand he carried a small cedar box. In the other, a loaf of bread still warm from the village oven. The silver clasp hung at his throat on a new leather cord, bright against the collar of his shirt. Elias met him at the threshold. For a moment neither spoke. The forge fire crackled. Somewhere a robin trilled. Then Cale held out the cedar box. "Something for the anvil," he said simply. Inside lay a single horseshoe nail, hand-forged from the last fragment of the melted clasp. The head bore the same mountain laurel pattern, but the metal had been tempered and polished until it shone like moonlight. Elias lifted it between thumb and forefinger, feeling the faint warmth of memory trapped within the steel. "It kept me honest," Cale said, voice low enough that only Elias could hear. "Now it keeps you steady." Sarah stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Stay for supper," she said. "Bread's fresh, and Mara's made a pie from the first strawberries." They ate at the long table Elias had built from the scaffold beam's ashes, its grain dark and fragrant, the legs carved with laurel leaves that matched the clasp's design. Cale sat between Mara and Elias, sleeves still rolled, cold dust on his knuckles. When Mara asked him to tell the story of the silver clasp again, he obliged, but his voice had lost the urgency of flight. Now it carried the quiet cadence of legend told by the fireside. After the plates were cleared, Elias led Cale outside. Twilight had painted the valley violet and rose, and the first stars pricked the eastern ridge. They walked the perimeter of the forge, the repaired roofline, the new windows glinting like watchful eyes. At the apple tree, Elias stopped. "I thought the debt was paid," he said, resting a hand on the smooth bark. "But maybe a debt like ours isn't a ledger to close. Maybe it's a seed to keep planting." Cale nodded. "Then let's plant it together." From his pocket he produced a second nail, identical to the first but unpolished, still bearing the forge's heat. He pressed it into Elias's palm. "For Mara's toy horse, and for every child who'll need a story braver than the rope." They walked back inside. The forge glowed, the bellows sighed, the anvil waited. Cale took up the hammer Elias handed him, its handle worn smooth by generations, and struck the first blow of a new shoe. Sparks scattered, and Mara laughed, chasing them with outstretched fingers. When the shoe cooled, Elias hung it above the door, next to the little horseshoe Mara had made that morning. Two crescents of iron, one bright, one dark, caught the lamplight like paired moons. Later, Sarah banked the fire. Mara curled against Cale's side, asleep before the story ended. Elias stood at the threshold, watching the night settle over the valley. The wind carried the scent of apple blossoms and coal smoke, of beginnings that smelled nothing like endings. Behind him, Cale spoke without turning. "The mountain taught me that mercy is the only thing that grows when you give it away." Elias closed the door gently, the clasp at Cale's throat catching the last glint of firelight. "Then let's keep planting," he said, "until the whole valley rings with it." Somewhere in the distance, the courthouse bell tolled midnight. Not the clang of judgment, but the soft chime of a watchman who had learned the difference between law and grace. The sound drifted down the valley and settled over the forge like a blessing, and for the first time in 12 years, Elias Ward slept without dreaming of ropes.